You are listening to the Novel Writing Podcast, episode 218. I'm your host, Colleen Mitchell. Grab a cup, cozy up, and let's get to writing. Today we're going to discuss the value of short cycle feedback, especially early in the writing process. This is when you get scene level or chapter level feedback from critique partners pretty much as you write, whether it's on a weekly basis or some other cadence. However, you can get the same sort of feedback on a finished draft, like when you're in rewrites, by sending your critter one chapter at a time and then filtering those changes through the rest of the book as you go. The primary purpose of short cycle feedback is so you don't end up struggling through the middle, constantly rewriting the first chapter, or even never finishing the book. And I say that last one because we've all started projects we haven't finished, whether due to the story meandering until we lose interest, or we write ourselves into corners, or we legitimately have no idea if anyone would even want to read the story. Short cycle feedback should not come from family or friends who A, don't read in the genre you write, or B, don't want to hurt your feelings. The most useless critique any writer can receive is, "It's great, I loved it," without anything constructive. Rather, you want to get feedback from a variety of sources. Fellow authors who write in the same genre you do, cross-genre authors, readers who read the same genre you write, readers who read any genre and are willing to provide tough feedback. I hope you're sensing a theme. The most valuable critique comes from people familiar with your genre or familiar with storycraft regardless of genre. If I wrote fantasy westerns, I would not want feedback from someone who exclusively reads or writes horror. I would want readers and writers familiar with fantasy, westerns, or preferably both. Genre preferences among feedback partners is essential since reader expectations vary across genres, and it's important to make sure you're hitting the right beats. How it works, at least in the critique groups I'm part of, is by submitting one chapter a week for review, usually in Google Docs. Recipients make comments, suggest changes, and sometimes we discuss live on a video call. If you know you have something in particular you're working on or want feedback on, character arc, subplot motion, or pacing, for example, you ask for it when posting. As a critiquer myself, I tend to turn every critique into a copy edit or dev review because that's just how my brain works. But some people comment more, some less, and some prefer to provide a summary of their thoughts at the very end without commenting at all. Regardless how the feedback is given, the important part is to not take any of it personally. Critique is about the work, not about you. You are not your work. Receiving critique is a skill, and it requires thicker skin than most of us have when we first crank out a book. The initial instinct is to protect the words like they're our children, which, sure, it can certainly feel like it at times, but growth never happens in a vacuum. To improve our writing, we have to be able to accept feedback, whether it's from critique partners or professional editors. I've talked before about how I usually resist every idea Haley throws at me during developmental reviews because I need to sit with big changes before embracing them with open arms. However, every time I've come around and eventually agreed with her, even if I hated the suggestion on the call, the story becomes better. Short cycle feedback is a less intimidating way to start building that thicker skin with critique on a single chapter rather than the entire epic. So that being said, why short cycle over finishing the draft and then sending it for alpha or professional edits? A lot of the time, big picture story issues show up in the discrete chunks of scenes and chapters. Even if your critter doesn't see the entire manuscript, they can still identify weak through lines or arcs that end up tanking the strength of the overall book just from seeing it one chapter at a time. My perspective is that critique partners and alpha readers shouldn't always replace professional edits, especially if you're a newer writer, but you may find that the feedback you get from those sources makes the dev edits more valuable and you end up going through fewer rounds. And as a side note, opinions remain split on the value of developmental editors at all for self-published authors. Seth Ring, for example, exclusively uses short cycle feedback from readers in his genre to ensure the book hits what readers want, not what dev editors think should happen. E.A. Winters relies on a detailed outline and a clean first draft, and then she sends it to copy editors. Any short cycle feedback occurs before the copy edit. And for me, all the books in my core series have gone through developmental edits because for sure they all needed it. That being said, here's a practical example of me using short cycle feedback to strengthen the quote-unquote first draft of The Witch Queen of Camelot enough that I don't feel like it actually needs to go through developmental edits. And quick disclaimer, Witch Queen is the 6th book I've written. It has multiple set-in-stone canon details which can't be changed, and I intentionally structured it using storycraft techniques I've learned since starting publishing. Not everyone can or should skip dev edits, and the fact that I'm skipping them on Witch Queen does not mean that I'm eschewing dev edits on all future books. All right, so disclaimer over. For Witch Queen, I dictated roughly the first half and then tossed it lightly edited into my critique partner's laps one chapter at a time. By the time the first few chapters got feedback, I'd realized I had to scrap a subplot, do a deep dive on my character and world worksheets, and then re-outline how the first half and then subsequently the rest of the book unfolded. Then I rewrote that first half while still getting feedback on the chapters I could, and wrote the second half. The second half came out much cleaner than the first because I'd gotten that short cycle feedback on those early chapters. As of this episode, Witch Queen is in its last week with alpha readers, and I expect it back on Sunday. This probably won't happen with every book because each story has its own needs, but the earlier feedback you can get on those early chapters, the better. It allows you to do a better job avoiding pitfalls in the writing process. Now, if you're in a critique group or receiving short cycle feedback, the social contract is generally that you're swapping chapters. If I get a chapter critiqued, that means I critique someone else's chapter. And the beauty of this is that critiquing someone else's work makes you a better writer. When you see story issues crop up in a friend's chapter, it becomes easier to avoid writing those same story issues in yours. It's also easier to see what doesn't work in someone else's writing than it is to see it in your own. Dang those rose-colored glasses. Because critiquing and writing are two different skills. But over time, the more you critique, the better your own writing turns out, especially those pesky first drafts. The natural question then becomes, how do you find critique partners for that short cycle feedback? If you're a Christian spec-fic writer, that means sci-fi, fantasy, and all their subgenres, then the Realm Sphere is a fantastic place to begin, and you can find a link to that in the description. But if you don't write those genres or you're not a Christian, I did an episode on how to find critters way back in episode 117, which will be linked in the show description. The information in that episode regarding professional premium and the 60-day challenge are now out of date, but options still exist within special interest groups, whether on Facebook, Threads, etc., or even paid marketplaces like Critique Match. This is a rant for another time, but under no circumstances would I recommend Readsy. Honestly, the first place to begin is by swallowing the discomfort of telling your friends and family that you wrote something, and then ask the ones who are interested in that genre if they'd be willing to read it. We all have to start somewhere, and starting can often be the hardest part. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for joining me, and remember, the first draft is supposed to be garbage. The Novel Writing Podcast is a production of Colleen Mitchell Writes. For more writing resources, including Curios, Tally Inc. author surfaces, and the 60-day novel writing challenge, check out the links in the description.